Do you feel discouraged when you sew because none of your projects ever come out looking quite right? Well, you're in luck because in this video I'm going to be talking about some techniques that have helped transform my sewing projects from homemade looking monstrosity into clothes that look like they might actually have been bought from a store. Now, a quick disclaimer. This video is primarily for people who have either never sewn before but they're hoping to get started, or you just started sewing and you still feel that you're at a beginner level. If you've eased in a sleeve before, if you know what understitching is, if your pressing skills are on point, then you don't need this video. Okay, so in order to get good at sewing, there's actually 3 different sets of skills that you need to get comfortable with. The first one is pretty obvious. It's actually operating the sewing machine and maneuvering the fabric. The second one is understanding garment construction. And the third one is what I'm going to call allied skills. These are skills that are not actually a part of sewing, but they are your allies in making sure that your projects look great. Let's start with actually operating the sewing machine. Within this skill set, there are, I would say, 5 key components: sewing straight, controlling the speed, manipulating the fabric, easing in, and choosing the right accessories for the job. Let's start with sewing straight. This is going to be a little bit of a controversial opinion, but as someone who doesn't always sew perfectly straight, I think this one's a little bit overrated. Like, yes, obviously in a professional setting it's going to cause problems if you don't sew straight, but for home sewing projects, I find that it doesn't usually make that big of a difference if it's like a 1/16 or even an 1/8 of an inch off in some places. I said what I said. That said, the best tip I have for sewing straight is look where you want to go. It's like driving a car. If you look straight down, you're gonna have a problem. So don't look at the needle. Don't look at the fabric that's just about to go under the needle. Look at the line on your sewing machine guide that corresponds to your seam allowance, because that's where you want your fabric edge to line up. If you don't have the proper measurement for the seam allowance of your project on your machine, like say you want to sew at 5/8 of an inch but your machine just doesn't label it, measure out from your needle to 5/8, put a piece of colorful tape there and use that as your guide. A lot of people also like to use these little magnets as a guide, so try that if just using the guide isn't working for you. And don't obsess over sewing straight, honestly. Using these techniques and practicing will get you there in time. Plus, using the other tips that I'm going to show you in this video will make your not so straight sewing less obvious. Next, we're going to talk about controlling the speed. Obviously, it's going to be hard to sew straight and nicely if you're going way too fast. I personally like to have my heel down on the ground and use the ball of my foot or my toes to control the pedal, instead of like having my heel off the ground and using the entire weight of my foot on the pedal. But I'd say test with some fabric scraps and see what works best for you in terms of figuring out how to control pressure on the foot pedal. Now we're going to talk about manipulating the fabric, and what I mean by that is basically just how you're holding the fabric as you're sewing. Basically, you want your hands to be pretty much right here the whole time, and they're just kind of holding the fabric steady as it goes through the feed dog so that it's not slip sliding all over the place. You don't need to be pushing it through, you don't want to be yanking it backwards, just hold it steady. If you're working with slippery or stretchy fabrics and it's causing you grief, you can try sewing with a piece of tissue paper or pattern paper in between that you rip out afterwards. You can also get a walking foot to help you sew knit fabric if it's giving you problems. Quick side note, I didn't think of this until I was already done filming the main video, but I realized I should probably let you know. For those of you who don't know, you can't just sew knits using like your regular machine and your regular stitch, because let me tell you, I did that one time with a pair of leggings, one of my first times sewing knits, and I don't wear those leggings ever. Why not? Because the seam in the butt doesn't exist anymore. Immediately after putting them on, like the calf seam started like ripping open, and then like a few seconds later, I don't even think it was minutes, I think it was literally seconds, the butt just ripped right open. So yeah, I am going to make a video about how exactly to sew knits. The short answer is serger, very small zigzag stitch or stretch stitch on your machine, but I'm going to be giving more info on that in a specific video about sewing knits and stretchy fabrics. So you know what to do. Subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss it. A walking foot has its own set of feed dogs that keep the top layer of fabric still and keep it from stretching around while you're sewing. This brings me to talking about choosing the right tools for the job. If you didn't already know, there are a lot of different types of sewing machine feet and needles, and using the right one for your project can make a big difference. Different fabrics work best with different needles. Wovens should obviously be sewn with needles for wovens, knits should be sewn with needles for knits. And even within those two categories of fabric, there's like a myriad of different other kinds of like sub types of needles. Leather, you should be using a leather needle and a leather foot, etc. And there are tons of different kinds of presser feet as well. I talked about the walking foot, but another favorite of mine is the top stitching foot, which can make your top stitching look real nice because you line up the edge of the foot with the edge of the seam that you're sewing next to. It's awesome. Anyway, definitely Google the type of fabric that you're using before you start and see if there's a specific type of needle or foot that you should be using. Just make sure it's the right one for your machine though. Like you don't want to I don't know, buy a serger needle for your domestic sewing machine or like get a low shank presser foot when your machine is a high shank. So anyway, when you are buying these things, make sure that it works for the specific make and model of your machine. The last thing I'm going to be talking about within the operating a sewing machine skill set is easing in. For those who don't know, easing something in is a very common procedure in sewing where one of the pieces of fabric that you're sewing is actually longer than the other one in order to make a nice curve or to allow for movement. Sleeves are obviously a very common example of this, as are princess seams. This can be tricky. In fact, I still regularly mess it up, but there are some things you can do to make it easier. To set yourself up for success, you'll want to make sure that you've transferred all of your notches from your pattern to your fabric, and then I'd recommend pinning the fabric at the notches so that you know where everything is supposed to line up and how much you have to ease in. When it comes to sleeves, particularly if you've made your own pattern, make sure there isn't too much ease there. Like, unless you're making a thick coat, there shouldn't be more than 1.5 inches of ease. If there is, it becomes more of a challenge to ease in. Okay, so believe it or not, I think all of the stuff that I just talked about is actually not as important as the two things I'm going to talk about now, because the two skill sets that I'm going to talk about now, if done well, can hide the fact that your sewing is a little bit iffy. So this next skill set is understanding garment construction. This just means understanding how clothing is made. What pattern pieces are required to make an item of clothing, how those pattern pieces fit together, how to finish seams so that it looks professional, etc. Nobody is born knowing this stuff, so you're gonna have to learn somehow. If you're an absolute beginner, I definitely recommend starting by taking a class. That way there's somebody there who can look at your work and give you feedback and also catch some of the common mistakes that beginners often make, like cutting things off grain, for example, etc. Once you've actually taken a class and you have some basics, like you know what the grain line is, you have an understanding of how to use commercial patterns, you know how to turn on and use the machine, then at that point, I'd say maybe you want to start like using YouTube tutorials or online classes or just like getting commercial patterns and tackling them yourself. The thing I'd recommend here is to follow the pattern instructions or the YouTube video steps very closely. Don't cut corners, don't like try to be creative and do something your own way, and definitely don't skip steps just because you don't understand them. If there's a term in your pattern that you don't understand, look it up on the internet and try to understand it, because it's often these confusing and skippable looking steps that are actually going to make your clothing look really nice. Speaking of which, there are two topics that I'd recommend looking into if you really want to take your garments to the next level. The first one is linings and facings, and I've linked a video by Zoe Hong on this topic in the description box below. Linings and facings are your #1 ally in making sure that your garments look finished professionally, because they hide all the inside construction and they also allow you to finish the seams without doing like weird janky top stitching on the outside the way I used to finish all of my seams. The second topic is understitching, and I've linked a video about that from Evelyn Wood's channel in the description box below. Understitching will change your life. You'll go from, why is this piece of fabric sticking out and not laying flat and looking weird, to, wow, that looks pretty nice. The last thing I'll say about garment construction is when you're learning to make a new type of garment or you're learning a new technique, it may take a few tries to get it right. I'd recommend buying a couple meters or even an entire roll of muslin or another type of cheap fabric to practice on before going all out with your good fabric. And I need to take my own advice on that. Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk about is what I'm calling allied skills, because these skills are your allies in making your clothing not look homemade. The main ones I'm focusing on here are cutting and pressing, and let me tell you, they are both so underrated, especially pressing. Let's start with cutting. Before you even cut the fabric, you need to make sure that your pattern piece is lined up on the grain line, and I've linked a video below in case you don't know what that is. You should also measure every time to make sure it's actually on the grain line, don't just guess. You also need to transfer all your notches from the pattern to the fabric, okay? This is so important, and I used to have a habit of not doing it, but that's how you get really janky results, like a sleeve hanging weird because you didn't know exactly where to attach it. If you're making your own patterns, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend right at the beginning, make sure it actually has notches. Now, when it comes to the actual cutting, you want to be as precise as possible. I almost always trace my patterns first with either tailor's chalk or a chalk pen and then cut inside the lines, not on the lines. I typically use a combination of a rotary cutter and scissors for curvier areas to ensure the most precision. Another tip with cutting is beware of the fold. I know it can be tempting if you have to cut 2 or more of the same pattern piece to just fold the fabric over and then trace once and cut them all at the same time, but this is not always a good idea. If your fabric is in any way stretchy or slippery, absolutely do not do this. Cut this type of fabric one piece at a time, and in fact, you may want to put a piece of tissue paper over top to stabilize it. For instance, if I'm cutting some Bemberg lining fabric, I will actually often put a piece of like ironed muslin underneath and then put some transparent tissue paper over top so that it's really, really stable, because Lord knows this fabric will slip and slide and shift, and before long you will look at your pattern piece and realize that it looks nothing like the fabric that you just cut out. All right, I've saved the best for last here, but finally we're on to pressing. Now let's start with a disclaimer. Not all fabrics can tolerate the same temperature. Some of them will need a pressing cloth or a piece of muslin over top when you're pressing them, and there are a few that just do not like being pressed at all. So do a little search before you start on the type of fabric you're using and see what type of temperature it needs, if it needs a pressing cloth or other special treatment, etc. before you start. I'd also recommend doing a little test on a square of fabric just to be safe. Okay, now with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get to it. Pressing will absolutely change your life. Like, look at this little lightweight jacket that I made. This is before pressing. It's ripply and crinkly and just looks awful. 2 years ago, I would have sewn something like this and been like, oh my god, it's so ugly, I'm terrible at sewing, I need to just throw this out and start over. Nuh-uh, honey. The trick is smothering it with a hot iron until it bends to your will. And that's what pressing is. Contrary to popular belief, pressing and ironing are not the same thing. Ironing is basically like moving the iron all around the garment in order to remove wrinkles, whereas pressing is using the heat and steam of the iron combined with tools like a tailor's ham or clapper in order to mold the fabric into a desired shape. You're also not moving the iron all around like this when you're pressing. You're just like putting it up and down, or sometimes like moving it forward. So watch this. I took the crinkly, wrinkly jacket that I just sewed and I wanted to press the seam allowance to the side. So first I press the seam allowance open like this to kind of get the creases out, and then I press it down to the side. I hold the iron for 10 seconds, and as you can see, it is kind of down, but not completely, so then I put the clapper on it for about 10 seconds, and magic. Look at that. So I did that with every seam, and now look at it. My phone quality is not the greatest, but you can see how much better that looks than before I pressed it, right? And if I wanted to press over a curved area, I would press it over the ham first so that I wouldn't just be like pressing it completely flat. I've got to be honest with you. I actually really hate pressing. I find it like time consuming and annoying, and I weirdly think I'm like bad at it. But you really cannot argue with the results. Like, did you see that? It made such a huge difference. So just get used to it and start smothering all your problems away with a hot iron. That's all for today, folks. I know that was a little bit overwhelming, so I'd recommend taking 1 or 2 techniques to practice at a time, and one of those should be pressing, in my opinion. And then once you've mastered that, go back and try to find other ones. Within a few months, you'll either be amazing at sewing, or like me, you'll be able to fool people into thinking you're good at sewing when really you're not that great. All right, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.